There are some stories that make you question how far a neighbor is willing to go just to cause chaos. Imagine waking up on a sunny morning, sipping your coffee, and stepping outside, only to find your car, your pride and joy, ruined with deep, ugly scratches running down the side. That was my reality, and little did I know it would spiral into one of the wildest neighborhood dramas I had ever experienced. This wasn't just about a scratch, it was about lies, revenge, and a showdown at the HOA meeting that no one in the neighborhood would forget. It started on a Tuesday morning. The air was calm, the birds were out, and I was planning on heading to work early. As I approached my car, parked neatly in the driveway, my stomach dropped. From the front fender, all the way to the rear door, a jagged line carved itself into the paint like someone had taken a knife to it. I crouched down, running my fingers over the damage, and the rage immediately began to boil. This wasn't an accident. No kid's bicycle had done this. It was deliberate, a malicious act. And in that moment, one name instantly came to mind. Karen. Karen had been my neighbor for years, and from the very beginning, she made it her mission to turn the simplest things into problems. From complaining about my lawn height to filing noise complaints when I had family over for dinner, she was the kind of neighbor who lived to stir the pot. And recently, the tension had escalated when she went after my parking habits. Even though my car was always in my driveway, she insisted it somehow ruined the neighborhood's look. She had gone as far as bringing it up in the last HOA meeting, claiming I was bringing down property values because of how often my car was outside. The president of the HOA dismissed her concerns, but I could tell she wasn't done. Seeing the damage that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was her way of sending a message. Still, suspicion wasn't proof, and Karen was the type of person who could look you dead in the eye and deny everything, even if the evidence was right in front of her. I needed to stay calm. I needed to think carefully. My first instinct was to call the police, but I knew how slippery Karen was with her words. What if she turned the tables and made it look like I was targeting her? I couldn't walk into this battle blind. I needed evidence. That was when I remembered my security cameras. Months earlier, after one of Karen's many antics, I had installed cameras facing both the front of my house and the driveway. At the time, it felt like an unnecessary precaution, but now I silently thanked my past self for making that decision. I rushed inside, opened up the footage from the night before, and let the hours play through. For a while, nothing happened, just the quiet, peaceful neighborhood at rest. Then, at around midnight, movement caught my eye. There she was, Karen, dressed in a light hoodie, her hair tied back, and her body moving suspiciously close to my car. She glanced around the street, checking for anyone watching, and then slowly bent down near the side of my vehicle. In her hand, something glimmered faintly under the porch lights, and then it happened. With one deliberate motion, she dragged it across the side of my car, leaving behind the long, hateful scar I discovered in the morning. After finishing her dirty work, she casually walked back toward her house, as if nothing had happened. My blood boiled watching it. The audacity, the malice, the sheer stupidity of doing something like that under a camera. I replayed it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining things. This was no misunderstanding. Karen had vandalized my property, and now I had solid proof. But even with the footage, I knew this wasn't going to be simple. Karen was a manipulator, someone who thrived on twisting stories to her benefit. If I confronted her directly, she would deny it, maybe even accuse me of editing the footage or targeting her unfairly. The smarter move was to bide my time. The upcoming HOA meeting was only days away, and I knew she would show up, probably running her mouth about something petty again. That would be my chance. If she wanted to play games, I was about to bring the kind of evidence she couldn't talk her way out of. The days leading up to the meeting were tense. I avoided direct contact with her, but I could feel her eyes on me whenever I left the house. At one point, she even had the nerve to wave at me from her porch, acting as though nothing had happened. Inside, I wanted to shout at her, but I stayed calm. Let her think she had gotten away with it. The more confident she felt, the harder she would fall when the truth came out. By the night of the HOA meeting, I was ready. The room filled with neighbors, the usual mix of chatter, complaints, and discussions about maintenance. And of course there was Karen, sitting in the corner with her smug expression, pretending to be the model citizen. She had no idea what was coming. I sat there quietly, waiting for my moment, the USB drive with the camera footage in my pocket like a weapon ready to be unleashed. When the floor opened up for complaints and discussions, Karen wasted no time. She launched into another rant, this time about how my car was an eyesore for being parked outside, how she had heard rumors of it lowering property values, and how the HOA needed to take action. Her words dripped with arrogance, and several neighbors rolled their eyes, clearly tired of her antics. I stayed silent, letting her dig her own grave. Then, when she finally paused to take a breath, I raised my hand. It was my turn. As I stood up and began to speak, the room grew quiet. I explained what had happened, the scratches on my car, and how I had initially kept my suspicions to myself. I told them I didn't want to bring accusations without proof, but thankfully, I had invested in security cameras. I could see Karen shift uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes narrowing as she realized where this was going. And then, without hesitation, I pulled out the USB drive and handed it to the HOA president. The video played on the large screen at the front of the room, and the gasps filled the air almost immediately. Every neighbor's eyes widened as Karen's face appeared on the screen, creeping toward my car in the dead of night. The sound of keys scraping metal echoed through the speakers, undeniable and incriminating. When the video ended, the silence was deafening. Everyone turned to look at Karen. Her face had drained of color, her mouth opening slightly as if searching for words, but nothing came out. She was caught, and yet this was only the beginning. What happened next would take this neighborhood drama to an entirely new level. The room was frozen in silence after the footage ended. Every neighbor sat stunned, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering under their breath. The image of Karen vandalizing my car was still fresh in everyone's mind, and there was no escaping the reality of what she had done. Yet, if there was one thing everyone knew about Karen, it was that she wasn't the type to admit defeat. Slowly, she shifted in her chair, straightening her back and raising her chin as though preparing for battle. And then, like clockwork, the excuses began to pour out. She insisted the video wasn't clear enough, that the figure on the screen could have been anyone. She claimed the hoodie distorted her appearance and that the lighting made it look worse than it really was. Some neighbors narrowed their eyes, clearly unconvinced, but Karen wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice rising with fake indignation, accusing me of manipulating the footage. According to her, I had somehow edited the video to frame her, all because of our petty disagreements. Her words grew faster, her tone more desperate, but the more she talked, the less anyone seemed to believe her. The HOA president cut her off, reminding her that the footage was direct, unaltered, and taken from a licensed home security system. Karen's face reddened, and she looked around the room for allies, but no one spoke in her defense. The very neighbors she had pestered for years now stared back at her with looks of disdain. It was a turning point. For once, Karen's manipulative tactics were failing right in front of everyone. Still, she refused to back down. She demanded the issue be dropped, claiming she was the victim of a smear campaign. Her arrogance was almost laughable, but inside, I felt a mix of frustration and satisfaction. I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the kind of person who would quietly accept defeat, even when the truth was undeniable. She would find another angle, another way to twist the narrative. And sure enough, within minutes she tried to pivot the conversation. She began ranting about how I had no right to have cameras pointing at community property. According to her, the cameras invaded her privacy and violated neighborhood regulations. It was a desperate attempt, one that only made her look guiltier. The HOA president calmly explained that the cameras were legally installed and entirely on my property, which meant I had every right to record activity in my driveway. Karen's argument fell apart instantly, and once again she was left sputtering. By this point, the room had turned against her. Neighbors who had stayed quiet before started speaking up. One by one, they shared their own grievances, stories of petty harassment, strange incidents, and Karen's constant meddling. It became clear that I wasn't the only one who had been targeted. Karen's long history of drama was finally catching up to her, and the evidence of her vandalism had opened the floodgates. The HOA president announced that the matter would be formally reviewed, but the video evidence was more than enough to warrant serious consequences. Karen was ordered to cover the cost of repairs for my car, and discussions of additional fines were placed on the agenda. The murmurs in the room grew louder, neighbors whispering about how this was the final straw, how Karen's antics had gone too far. But Karen, being Karen, refused to stay quiet. She stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her, her face twisted in anger. I watched her go, part of me relieved, but another part uneasy. People like her didn't just let things go. She was embarrassed, exposed, and cornered, which meant retaliation was almost guaranteed. Sure enough, the very next day, the games began. I woke up to find passive-aggressive notes taped to my mailbox, accusing me of ruining her reputation. Later, I noticed her pacing near her driveway, talking loudly on her phone, making sure I could overhear her calling me a liar and a bully. She even went so far as to spread rumors around the neighborhood, claiming I was the one who had scratched my own car for attention. At first, I tried to ignore it. The footage spoke for itself, and anyone who saw it knew the truth. But Karen's persistence was relentless. She started filing complaints with the HOA, claiming I was harassing her, that my cameras were pointed directly at her house, and that she no longer felt safe. Each time, the claims were dismissed, but the constant stream of drama was exhausting. It was clear she was on a mission to flip the narrative and make herself the victim. Then came the tipping point. One afternoon, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Karen standing with two other neighbors. She was pointing at my car, animatedly talking, and when she noticed me, she gave me a smug smile. Later that evening, I found out she had been telling people the HOA was considering fining me instead, a complete fabrication. She was actively trying to rewrite the story, and some newer neighbors who hadn't seen the footage firsthand were starting to question what really happened. I realized then that Karen's greatest weapon wasn't her ability to argue, but her ability to manipulate perception. If left unchecked, her lies could spread far enough to muddy the waters. I couldn't allow that to happen. The truth had to remain louder than her fiction. So, I doubled down. I made copies of the footage and provided them directly to neighbors who hadn't attended the meeting. I explained the situation calmly, showing them exactly what happened and letting the video speak for itself. One by one, the doubts faded and the support grew stronger. Karen's lies were crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. But while most neighbors sided with me, Karen's bitterness only deepened. Late at night, I could see her blinds shifting, her silhouette watching from the window. Sometimes I'd hear her slamming doors or yelling on the phone. It was clear she was unraveling, her pride shattered by being caught so publicly. And yet, I knew she wasn't done. Karen wasn't the type to fade quietly into the background. That was when I got the letter. A formal notice slipped into my mailbox demanding that I remove my cameras immediately or face legal action. The letter was signed not by the HOA, but by Karen herself, written in a tone that dripped with fake authority. It was almost laughable, but also deeply unsettling. She was escalating again, and there was no telling how far she'd go. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the neighborhood was buzzing with tension. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Would Karen finally face the consequences, or would she manage to spin her lies into another round of chaos? As I walked into the meeting room, USB drive in hand once again, I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me. Karen sat across the room, her arms crossed tightly, her face pale but defiant. This was the moment. The drama that had started with a single scratch on my car was about to reach its peak. The night of the second HOA meeting arrived like the climax of a storm. By now, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with whispers of what had happened between me and Karen. Some neighbors were eager to see justice finally delivered, while others were simply curious about the spectacle that was bound to unfold. No matter which side they leaned toward, one thing was clear. Everyone knew something big was coming. I walked into the room with my head held high, carrying not just the original footage, but every piece of evidence I had collected since Karen began her smear campaign. I was prepared for anything she might throw at me. Across the room, Karen sat rigidly in her chair, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes darted around nervously, though she tried to mask it with an air of defiance. She was cornered, and she knew it, but Karen was never the type to surrender without a fight. The meeting began as usual, with routine updates about landscaping, budgets, and maintenance. But the atmosphere was tense, as though everyone was waiting for the moment when the real fireworks would begin. And then, almost on cue, Karen raised her hand. Her voice carried across the room, sharp and indignant. She accused me once again of harassing her, of pointing my cameras directly at her property, and of waging a campaign to destroy her reputation. She waved a stack of papers, her so-called evidence, claiming it proved I had violated her privacy and broken neighborhood rules. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, tired of hearing the same accusations. Others leaned forward, curious to see how the battle would play out. The HOA president gave her space to speak, then turned the floor over to me. This was it, the moment everything had been leading up to. I stood, my hands steady despite the adrenaline running through me, and calmly laid out the truth. First, I addressed her privacy claims. I showed diagrams of how my cameras were positioned, pointing only at my driveway and yard, never at her property. The HOA board confirmed that my setup was entirely legal and compliant with neighborhood rules. Strike one against Karen. Next, I pulled out the original footage again. The screen at the front of the room flickered to life, and once more, the image of Karen creeping up to my car filled the room. The sound of her keys scraping against my paint echoed like nails on a chalkboard. Gasps rippled through the crowd, even though many had already seen it. The power of watching it again, in this room, was undeniable. Karen shrank back in her chair, her face growing redder with every passing second. Strike two. But I wasn't finished. I revealed the letter she had slipped into my mailbox, the one falsely demanding I remove my cameras. I held it up for everyone to see, pointing out that it wasn't official HOA documentation at all, just a personal attempt at intimidation signed by her own hand. Strike three. By the time I finished, the room was buzzing. Neighbors who had once remained neutral were now openly voicing their frustration with Karen. They spoke of years of petty complaints, false accusations, and endless drama. One neighbor recalled how she had tried to fine them for leaving a holiday decoration up a day too long. Another remembered her threatening to call the city because their kids were playing outside too loudly. For years, Karen had terrorized the neighborhood with her self-appointed authority, and now, thanks to the footage, the dam had finally broken. The HOA president cleared his throat, calling the room back to order. He announced that, given the overwhelming evidence, Karen would be fined heavily for vandalizing my car, required to pay for the full cost of repairs, and formally reprimanded for her repeated false claims. On top of that, the board was considering removing her from any future involvement in HOA decision-making. It was a devastating blow, the very power she craved, stripped away in front of everyone. Karen's reaction was as explosive as expected. She shot up from her chair, her voice shaking as she screamed about conspiracies, claiming everyone was out to get her. She accused the HOA president of favoritism, accused me of fabricating everything, and accused the entire neighborhood of turning against her unfairly. But her tantrum only dug the hole deeper. No one was buying it anymore. Neighbors who once avoided conflict now stood their ground, openly challenging her lies. Finally, the HOA president asked her to leave the meeting. She refused at first, ranting and pacing, but eventually stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls rattled. The room exhaled collectively, the tension breaking into murmurs of relief. For the first time in years, the neighborhood had stood together, and Karen's reign of petty tyranny had been shattered. In the weeks that followed, life in the community slowly returned to normal. My car was repaired, fully paid for by Karen's forced reimbursement. My cameras remained in place, untouched and legal, a silent reminder that the truth can't be hidden forever. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now waved and chatted more often, united by the shared experience of finally standing up to Karen. It was as though the entire block had been holding its breath for years, and now they could finally breathe again. As for Karen, her behavior changed, though not in the way one might expect. She withdrew from public life, no longer attending HOA meetings, no longer parading around the neighborhood with her usual smugness. Her curtains stayed drawn most days, and her once loud voice was rarely heard. Rumors circulated that she was considering moving, unable to handle the humiliation of what had happened. Whether she stayed or left, one thing was certain: she had lost her grip on the community. Looking back, it's almost surreal how one act of vandalism unraveled years of manipulation. A single scratch on my car had set off a chain of events that exposed the truth and gave the neighborhood the courage to push back. In the end, Karen wasn't just caught by a camera, she was destroyed by her own arrogance, her own inability to admit when she was wrong. And if there's one lesson to take from all of it, it's this. In a world where people like Karen exist, sometimes the best revenge isn't anger, or shouting, or stooping to their level. Sometimes it's patience, preparation, and letting the truth play out in front of everyone. Because when the mask finally slips and the whole world sees who they really are, there's nowhere left for them to hide. For me, it started with a scratch, but it ended with justice and a neighborhood finally free from the grip of chaos.